The choke came fast, dirty and confident. 2 arms around the new inmate's neck, a forearm crushing his windpipe. The Asian man didn't struggle. No panic, no flailing. His eyes stayed open. "Breathe," one bully laughed, squeezing harder. "Let's see how long you last." But the inmate did something no one expected. He relaxed, his shoulders dropped, his breath slowed. Not shallow, not rushed. Deep, silent, controlled. A guard watching from the tier leaned forward. That wasn't fear. That was rooting. The inmate shifted his weight, just an inch. He lowered his center of gravity, his heels pressed into the concrete like he was sinking into it. The bully scoffed. "What's that, Tai Chi?" The inmate spoke calmly, voice steady even as the grip tightened. "You're using strength. That's why you'll lose." Then, a twist of the waist, a subtle drop of the hips, a short, snapping movement that barely looked like anything at all. The choke vanished. The bully staggered back, gasping, confused, unhurt, terrified. Because what broke his hold wasn't power. It was structure, timing, technique refined over decades. This wasn't a man learning kung fu. This was a kung fu master choosing restraint. And in that moment, the entire block understood. They hadn't grabbed a weak inmate. They'd laid hands on something ancient. Stay with me until the end, because the next lesson he gives inside that prison won't be spoken. It'll be felt. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. 3 days earlier, Chen Wei walked through the steel gates of Riverside Correctional with nothing but the clothes on his back and 30 years of silence. The intake officer barely glanced at his paperwork. Age 52, 5'7", 160 pounds, non-violent financial crime. First offense. What the paperwork didn't say was that Chen had spent 4 decades studying Wing Chun, Shaolin, and internal martial arts under masters who could trace their lineage back centuries. It didn't mention the calloused knuckles hidden beneath soft hands, or the way he moved like water even when standing still. The prison saw an easy target, an older Asian man who spoke little English, kept his head down, and seemed to shrink into himself whenever voices got loud. Perfect prey for the wolves that ran the yard. Tommy Tank Morrison saw him first. Tank was a lifer, built like a bulldozer with arms covered in faded tattoos and scars that told stories of 100 fights won. He ruled C-Block through intimidation and violence, collecting debts and tribute from anyone weak enough to pay. "Fresh meat," Tank whispered to his crew as Chen shuffled past in his oversized orange jumpsuit. Look at him. Probably never threw a punch in his life. But Tank was wrong about everything except one thing. Chen had never thrown a punch in anger. Every movement he'd ever made in combat was calculated, controlled, designed not to destroy, but to neutralize. There was a difference Tank would soon learn. The first test came during lunch on Chen's second day. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual chaos of 500 men trying to eat processed food without starting a riot. Chen sat alone at the corner table, methodically eating his meal, eyes focused on his tray. That's when Diesel approached. 6'4", 280 pounds of muscle and meanness, Diesel was Tank's enforcer. He slammed his palm down on Chen's table, making the plastic tray jump. "You sitting in my spot, old man?" Chen looked up slowly, his dark eyes meeting Diesel's glare. He spoke quietly, accent thick but words clear. "I did not know. I will move." "Nah, too late for that." Diesel grinned, showing gold teeth. "You gonna have to pay rent now. What you got for me?" Chen reached into his pocket and pulled out a small packet of instant coffee, commissary currency worth maybe $2. He placed it on the table between them. Diesel laughed loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "That's it? That's all you got?" He snatched the coffee and leaned down until his face was inches from Chen's. "Tomorrow, you better have more. A lot more. Or we gonna have problems." Chen nodded once, gathered his tray, and moved to another table. But as he walked away, several inmates noticed something strange. His breathing never changed. His hands never shook. And when Diesel had gotten in his face, Chen's weight had shifted almost imperceptibly onto the balls of his feet. A skinny kid named Rico, doing time for car theft, watched the whole thing. Rico had grown up on the streets where reading people was survival. Something about the old man didn't add up. The way he moved, the way he held himself. It reminded Rico of his uncle Miguel, who'd trained in boxing before the drugs took him down. That night in their cell, Rico's cellmate Malik shook his head. That Chinese dude's gonna get eaten alive. Diesel's just getting started. But Rico wasn't so sure. Did you see his hands when he picked up that tray? Look at his knuckles next time. And the way he walks. It's like he's floating. Malik laughed. Man, you watch too many movies. That's just some scared old man trying not to get killed. The next morning brought the second test. Chen was in the shower room, one of the most dangerous places in any prison. No cameras, concrete walls that muffled sound, and nowhere to run. Tank had planned it perfectly. Chen stood under the lukewarm spray, letting the water run over his graying hair. His eyes were closed, but his other senses were fully alert. He heard the footsteps approaching, 3 sets, moving with purpose. He recognized the heavy tread of Diesel, the lighter steps of Snake, Tank's knife man, and the shuffling gait of Bones, a meth head who'd do anything for protection. Well, well, Tank's voice echoed off the tiles. Look what we got here. Old man thinks he can just ignore his debts. Chen opened his eyes but didn't turn around. In the reflection of the metal shower fixture, he could see all 3 men positioning themselves behind him. Tank held a sharpened piece of metal, a shiv made from a bed spring. Snake had something in his hand too, probably a lock and a sock. Bones was just there for numbers. I brought what I could, Chen said softly, not turning around. It is on the bench. Tank glanced over and saw another packet of coffee and a candy bar. His face darkened. You think this is a joke? You think I'm playing with you? No, Chen replied, his voice steady. I think you are angry because you are afraid. The words hung in the steamy air like a challenge. Diesel stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. What did you just say, old man? Chen finally turned around, water still streaming down his face. His posture was relaxed, arms loose at his sides, but something had changed in his eyes. They held a depth that suggested ancient knowledge, like looking into a well that had no bottom. You are afraid, he repeated, louder this time. Afraid that if you show mercy, others will see weakness. So you choose violence to hide your fear. But violence born from fear is always clumsy. Tank's face twisted with rage. You got some mouth on you for someone about to get carved up. He raised the shiv, ready to strike. That's when Chen did something that defied every expectation. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a crazy smile, but the peaceful expression of someone who had found perfect clarity in a moment of chaos. And then he began to move. Not the fluid, practiced movements of a fighter preparing for war. This was something else entirely. Chen stepped forward, and his first move was so subtle that Tank almost missed it. A shift of the hips, a gentle redirection of Tank's striking arm. The shiv swept past Chen's shoulder, missing by inches, and suddenly Tank found himself off balance, stumbling forward into empty space. Before Tank could recover, Chen's palm touched his wrist. Not a strike, just contact. But that touch guided Tank's momentum, spinning him in a half circle until he faced the shower wall. The shiv clattered to the floor. Diesel lunged next, throwing a haymaker that could have broken ribs. Chen simply wasn't there when the fist arrived. He had flowed around the punch like water around a stone, his hand finding Diesel's elbow and redirecting all that force into the concrete wall. Diesel's knuckles scraped tile, drawing blood. Snake tried to swing his weighted sock, but Chen caught his wrist mid-swing. For a moment, they stood frozen, Snake straining against what felt like an immovable force. Then Chen twisted his grip slightly, and Snake's weapon dropped from nerveless fingers as pressure points fired along his arm. The entire exchange lasted maybe 10 seconds. When it was over, all three attackers were on the ground. Not beaten, not broken, just neutralized. Tank clutched his wrist. Diesel nursed scraped knuckles, and Snake flexed his fingers, trying to restore feeling. Chen stood in the center of the shower, water still cascading over his shoulders, looking exactly as calm as when the fight began. He wasn't even breathing hard. "Violence is like water," he said quietly, reaching down to help Tank to his feet. "The more you fight against it, the stronger it becomes. But if you move with it, redirect it, it loses all power." Tank stared at him, confusion replacing anger. "What the hell are you?" "I am Chen Wei," he replied simply, "and I am here to serve my sentence in peace." Word of the shower room incident spread through Riverside Correctional like wildfire. But the story grew stranger with each telling. Some inmates swore Chen had thrown all three men across the room. Others claimed he'd moved so fast he'd been invisible. The truth was somehow more unsettling. He'd barely moved at all. Rico sought him out that evening during yard time. Chen sat alone on a bench, watching the sunset through the razor wire, his expression peaceful despite everything that had happened. "That was some Bruce Lee stuff back there," Rico said, sitting down uninvited. Chen shook his head. Bruce Lee was very different. He believed in fighting fire with fire. "I learned to fight fire with water." "Where'd you learn to do that?" "My grandfather owned a restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown. Behind the kitchen, he taught traditional martial arts to anyone willing to learn patience. I started when I was 12. Chen's voice grew distant with memory. 40 years of training, 30 years of practice. But this is the first time I've used it to protect myself. Rico leaned forward. "So you really are like some kind of master?" "Master is just a word," Chen replied. "What matters is understanding. These men who attacked me, they think strength comes from muscles, from fear, from reputation. But real strength comes from knowing when not to fight." That night in the common area, the dynamic had shifted. Inmates who'd ignored Chen before now watched him with curious respect. Tank and his crew sat at their usual table, but the swagger was gone. They looked like men who'd discovered the world wasn't quite what they thought it was. But Chen's real test was still coming. Because Tank might have been humbled, but he wasn't finished. A man doesn't build a reputation through decades of violence just to let it crumble over one strange encounter in a shower. The next morning brought a new challenge. During breakfast, a commotion erupted near the serving line. Two inmates were shoving each other, voices rising, fists clenched. It was the kind of fight that could spiral into a riot if left unchecked. Guards moved to intervene, batons ready, but Chen was closer. He stood up from his table and walked calmly toward the confrontation. Other inmates backed away, expecting violence. "Hey!" one of the fighters shouted at Chen. "This ain't your business, old man." Chen stopped just outside striking distance. "You are right. This is not my business. But peace is everyone's business." The second fighter, a young kid barely out of his teens, was shaking with adrenaline and fear. "He stole my commissary money. 3 weeks of savings." "Did you?" Chen asked the first man, a thick-set inmate covered in gang tattoos. "So what if I did? Kids gotta learn how things work in here." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Learning is important. May I teach you both something?" Before either could answer, Chen stepped between them. To the thief, he said, "You take what is not yours because you believe it makes you stronger. But theft is weakness disguised as power." Then he turned to the younger inmate. "And you prepare to fight because you believe anger will restore what was taken. But anger clouds judgment." The tattooed inmate snorted. "What are you going to do about it, Grandpa? Kung fu me to death?" Chen smiled that same peaceful smile from the shower. "I'm going to give you a choice. Return what you took, or lose something more valuable than money." "Yeah? Like what?" "Your reputation." The word hung in the air like a challenge. In prison, reputation was currency. It was armor. It was survival itself. Chen continued, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet cafeteria. Everyone here believes you are strong because you take from the weak. But what happens when they see you cannot take from one old man? The thief's eyes narrowed. You threatening me? I am offering wisdom. Return the money, and you remain what you believe yourself to be. Try to take from me instead, and discover what you actually are. The entire cafeteria was watching now. Guards had paused their approach, sensing something unusual unfolding. This wasn't the typical escalation toward violence they were trained to handle. The tattooed inmate looked around, seeing all the eyes on him. His reputation demanded he accept the challenge. But something in Chen's calm certainty made him hesitate. You got some balls, old man? He finally said. But balls don't stop fists. No, Chen agreed. But understanding does. And then Chen did something that shocked everyone watching. He held out his hand, palm up, completely vulnerable. Hit me, he said simply. As hard as you can. Right here. The offer hung in the air like a trap. The tattooed inmate stared at the open palm, then at Chen's serene expression. Around them, inmates held their breath. What's the catch? No catch. You want to prove strength through violence. I want to show you something different. Hit me as hard as you can. The challenge was impossible to refuse. The inmate drew back his fist, muscles coiling for maximum impact. When he threw the punch, it came with everything he had. Years of prison fights, street anger, and wounded pride all behind it. His fist connected with Chen's palm with a sound like a gunshot. The impact echoed through the cafeteria, and then something impossible happened. The inmate absorbed the blow completely, not the way a punching bag absorbs impact, the way water absorbs a stone. The force seemed to disappear into his body, traveling through his arm, across his shoulder, down his spine, and into the concrete floor beneath his feet. The tattooed inmate stumbled forward, his own momentum carrying him past Chen. His knuckles were already swelling, his wrist screaming in pain. He'd hit what felt like a brick wall disguised as flesh. How? He gasped, cradling his injured hand. Chen lowered his arm slowly. You struck with anger. Anger makes muscles tight, makes structure weak. I received with softness. Softness is stronger than hardness. The young inmate who'd lost his money stared in disbelief. Guards exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or watch this impossible physics lesson continue. Chen reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small stack of commissary tickets. He handed them to the younger man. Your money, he said simply. But I don't understand. You will. Chen turned back to the tattooed inmate who was still nursing his hand. And you now know the difference between taking and earning. The breakfast shift ended in unusual quiet. Men filed back to their cells or work assignments. But the conversations were different. Hushed. Thoughtful. Word of what they'd witnessed spread through the prison like smoke through ventilation. By afternoon count, Chen's reputation had transformed completely. He wasn't the weak old man anymore. He wasn't even the dangerous fighter. He was something else entirely, a mystery wrapped in orange fabric. But Tank wasn't finished. That evening, as inmates gathered in the common area for their few hours of recreation, Tank made his move, not with violence this time, but with something more dangerous in the confined world of prison, politics. Listen up, Tank announced, standing on a chair so his voice carried across the room. We got ourselves a problem. This old man's been making us all look like fools, acting like he's better than us, like he's some kind of teacher. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Tank had their attention. Now I ain't saying he can't handle himself in a scrap. Hell, maybe he knows some moves. But this ain't a karate tournament. This is prison. And in prison, there's only one rule that matters. Respect the hierarchy or get crushed by it. Chen sat in his usual corner, reading a paperback book someone had left behind. He didn't look up, but his posture suggested he was listening to every word. Tank continued. See, when one man starts thinking he's special, starts thinking the rules don't apply to him, that's when things fall apart. That's when chaos takes over. and chaos gets people hurt. A few inmates nodded. Tank's logic made sense in the brutal mathematics of prison life. Order, even violent order, was better than anarchy. So here's what's gonna happen. Tank's voice rose. The old man's gonna choose. He can fall in line like everybody else, show proper respect, pay his dues, or he can find out what happens when the whole block decides you're a problem that needs solving. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Chen, waiting for his response. He closed his book carefully, marking his place with a torn piece of paper. When he stood, his movements were unhurried, graceful. You speak of respect, Chen said, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness. But you do not understand what respect means. Tank's jaw tightened. I understand plenty, old man. Respect is not fear. Respect is not submission. Respect is recognition of worth. Chen walked to the center of the room, stopping just out of Tank's reach. You want me to fear you so you can feel strong. But strength built on fear is hollow. It crumbles the moment someone stops being afraid. Big words, Tank sneered. Let's see how big they sound when you're bleeding on the floor. Chen shook his head sadly. You still do not see. Violence is not power. Violence is the absence of power. It is what we use when we have no other tools. Then what would you use? The question came from Rico, genuinely curious. Chen smiled. Understanding, patience, and when necessary, redirection. Tank laughed harshly. You gonna redirect 30 guys jumping you at once? I will not need to. Chen's voice remained calm. Because most of these men are not your followers. They are prisoners of your reputation, just as you are. Free them from that prison, and they will choose their own path. The words hit the room like a physical force. Inmates looked around at each other, seeing something they hadn't noticed before. The way they deferred to Tank, not out of loyalty, but out of habit. Fear, convenience. Tank felt the shift immediately. His authority, built over years of calculated intimidation, suddenly felt fragile. Enough talking, he snarled. Bones, Snake, Diesel, take him down. But something unprecedented happened. The three men didn't move. They stood frozen, caught between old habits and new possibilities. Diesel spoke first, his voice uncertain. Tank, maybe you should what? Tank's voice cracked like a whip. Maybe you should grow a spine? Maybe you should remember who kept you alive in here? Or maybe, Chen interjected gently, they should remember that survival and living are not the same thing. The philosophical challenge hung in the air like incense. Men who hadn't thought beyond their next meal or their next fight suddenly found themselves considering deeper questions. Rico stood up slowly. I ain't jumping nobody today, Tank. Not for this. Tank's face went white with rage. You forgetting who you're talking to, boy? No, Rico replied, his voice gaining strength. I'm remembering who I am. One by one, other inmates began standing, not in aggression, but in quiet defiance of the old order. They weren't choosing Chen's side. They were choosing their own. Tank looked around the room, seeing his empire crumbling in real time. Years of carefully constructed fear dissolving like sugar in rain. This ain't over, he whispered to Chen. Not by a long shot. Chen nodded respectfully. I know, but when it comes, it will come differently than you expect. That night, the prison felt different. Guards noted it in their reports. Fewer incidents, less tension, conversations instead of confrontations. Something had shifted in the fundamental chemistry of the place. Chen lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling. His cellmate, a soft-spoken embezzler named Williams, finally worked up the courage to ask the question everyone wanted answered. Chen, what you did today, standing up to Tank like that, where'd you learn to be so brave? Chen turned his head slightly. I did not learn bravery, I learned fear. I don't understand. For 40 years, I was afraid of my own power, afraid of what I might do if I lost control. So I practiced control until it became natural. But control without purpose is just another kind of prison. Chen's voice grew thoughtful. Here, I discovered my purpose. Not to fight, but to show others they have choices. Williams was quiet for a moment. What happens now? Tank's not gonna let this go. Tank will do what Tank has always done. But the men around him, they are changing. And that changes everything. The next morning brought proof of Chen's words. During breakfast, inmates who had spent years avoiding eye contact began talking to each other. Small conversations, nothing dramatic, but the silence of intimidation was breaking down. Tank sat at his usual table, but it was smaller now. Only his most loyal followers remained, and even they seemed uncertain. The ecosystem of fear he'd cultivated was evolving into something unpredictable. Chen ate his meal quietly, but inmates approached his table throughout breakfast, not to challenge or confront, but to ask questions about martial arts, about philosophy, about the possibility of finding peace in a place designed to destroy it. Master Chen, a young inmate named Carlos asked, "Can anyone learn what you do?" "Anyone can learn technique," Chen replied, stirring powdered eggs. "But technique without wisdom is just choreography. First, you must understand why you want to learn." "To protect myself," Carlos answered quickly. Chen shook his head. "That is fear talking. Protection comes from understanding, not fighting. When you truly understand conflict, you can often avoid it entirely." An older inmate named Jackson leaned forward. "But what if avoidance ain't possible? What if someone's coming for you no matter what?" Chen set down his plastic spoon and looked Jackson in the eyes. "Then you must be like water. Water does not fight the rock. It flows around it, over it, through it. Eventually, water shapes the rock." "That sounds nice in theory," Jackson replied. "But rocks don't have knives." The comment drew nervous laughter from nearby tables. Chen smiled, appreciating the practical wisdom. "You are right. In here, philosophy alone will not keep you safe, but neither will violence alone. The key is balance, knowing when to flow and when to stand firm." As if summoned by the conversation, Tank appeared beside their table. His face was calm, but his hands were clenched into fists. "Having yourself a little school, Professor?" Tank's voice dripped sarcasm. "Teaching these boys how to be weak?" Chen looked up without fear. "I am teaching them how to be strong." "Your kind of strong got my cousin killed in Folsom," Tank snarled. "All that turn the other cheek garbage? Sometimes a man's gotta fight." "Your cousin died because he chose violence when other options existed," Chen replied quietly. "I am sorry for your loss, but his death does not justify more death." Tank's control snapped. "Don't you dare talk about my family!" He swung a haymaker at Chen's head, putting everything behind it. The entire cafeteria erupted in shouts and scraping chairs as inmates scrambled for position. But Chen wasn't there when the punch arrived. He had flowed out of his seat like water, Tank's fist whistling through empty air. The momentum carried Tank forward, off balance, vulnerable. Chen could have ended it then. A simple strike to Tank's exposed neck. A twist that would send him crashing into the table. Instead, Chen placed his hand gently on Tank's shoulder, steadying him as he stumbled. "Your anger honors your cousin's memory," Chen said softly. "But revenge will not bring him back." Tank jerked away from the touch, his face twisted with confusion and rage. "Get your hands off me!" Guards were moving now, batons drawn, shouting orders. The cafeteria was seconds away from a full riot. Chen raised his hands, palms open, voice cutting through the chaos. "Peace! There is no fight here!" His words carried an authority that even the guards recognized. The rush of boots slowed. Batons lowered slightly. Tank stood in the center of the silence, chest heaving, fists still clenched. He looked around the room, seeing inmates watching him with expressions he'd never seen before. Not fear, not respect, but something like pity. "This ain't finished," he whispered to Chen. "I know," Chen replied, "but when it is, we will both be different men than we are today." Tank stalked away, his remaining followers trailing behind like confused children. The guards dispersed slowly, tension still crackling in the air. Chen returned to his seat and picked up his spoon as if nothing had happened. But around him, the conversations had changed again. Men were talking about choices, about alternatives to violence, about the possibility that strength might mean something different than they'd always believed. The real transformation was just beginning. The weeks that followed brought an unexpected calm to Riverside Correctional. Where once the yard had echoed with threats and posturing, now inmates gathered in small circles, talking quietly. Chen's influence spread not through force or intimidation, but through something far more powerful: example. Every morning during yard time, Chen would find a quiet corner and begin his practice. Slow, flowing movements that looked more like dancing than fighting. At first, inmates mocked the strange ritual, but as days passed, the mockery turned to curiosity. "What's he doing over there?" asked Martinez, a gang member serving 15 for armed robbery. Rico, who had become something of an interpreter for Chen's philosophy, watched the graceful forms. He calls it meditation in motion. Says it teaches you to find stillness inside chaos. Looks like he's fighting invisible people. Martinez scoffed. But even as he spoke, Martinez found himself drawn to the hypnotic rhythm of Chen's practice. There was something peaceful about it, something that reminded him of Sunday mornings at his grandmother's church before his life went sideways. Chen noticed the growing audience but never acknowledged it directly. He simply continued his forms, breathing deeply, moving with the patience of centuries. Sometimes he would pause mid-movement, holding a position that looked impossible, balanced on one leg, arms extended like wings, perfectly still. "How long can he hold that?" whispered Carlos, the young inmate who had started asking Chen questions during meals. "As long as necessary," came a voice from behind them. They turned to see Williams, Chen's quiet cellmate, approaching with an armload of library books. "I asked him the same thing once. He said time only matters when you're fighting against it." The demonstration ended as it always did, with Chen bowing to the four directions, then settling into a cross-legged meditation position. His breathing slowed until it was barely visible, his face serene despite the razor wire and concrete surrounding him. But Tank was watching too, and what he saw only fueled his frustration. His empire of fear was crumbling, not through revolution or violence, but through something far more insidious: hope. Men who had accepted brutality as inevitable were beginning to imagine alternatives. "Look at them," Tank muttered to Diesel, his most loyal enforcer. "Standing around watching that old fool like he's some kind of prophet." Diesel nodded, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Ever since the shower incident, something had changed in him. The casual cruelty that had defined his prison existence felt hollow now, like a costume that no longer fit. "Maybe we should just leave him alone, Tank," Diesel suggested carefully. "He ain't causing trouble. If anything, things have been quieter since—" "Quieter?" Tank's voice rose dangerously. "You think quiet is good? Quiet means soft. Soft gets you killed in here." But even as he spoke, Tank could see the evidence of his failing authority. Inmates who used to flinch when he walked past now barely glanced up. His table in the cafeteria, once crowded with followers seeking protection, sat half empty. The breaking point came during a thunderstorm that knocked out half the prison's power. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through the corridors, and the usual electronic surveillance was reduced to sporadic coverage. It was the kind of night when old scores got settled and new hierarchies emerged from violence. Tank cornered Chen during the blackout, flanked by 6 desperate men clinging to the old ways. But when the lights flickered back on, guards found them sitting in a circle on the concrete floor, listening as Chen spoke quietly about his grandfather's restaurant and the difference between surviving and truly living. The Kung Fu master had won his greatest victory without throwing a single strike. He'd transformed a prison through patience, turned enemies into students, and proved that sometimes the most powerful technique is knowing when not to fight. Chen Wei served 18 months at Riverside. When he walked out those steel gates, he left behind something that couldn't be locked up: the knowledge that strength without wisdom is just destruction waiting to happen. True masters don't just defeat their opponents, they transform them, and in the end, that transformation echoes far longer than any knockout ever could. Have you ever seen real strength disguised as weakness? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more incredible stories of hidden power.